Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. The FAIRR Initiative, founded by the British businessman and philanthropist Jeremy Collar, is calling on G20 Finance Ministers to uphold their commitment to reform agricultural subsidies so that their countries can meet their net zero commitments by 2050, alongside meeting their commitments to global biodiversity and nature goals. Sofía Condés is the head of investor outreach for the FAIRR Initiative. I asked her to explain more about what the FAIRR Initiative is.
FAIRR is a nonprofit, and we run a collaborative investor network that raises awareness on the environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities in the global food sector. So at FAIRR, what we do is that we provide for our investor members comparative research tools, data, and also policy guidance that helps them navigate the complexity of the food sector, make more informed investment decisions, and use their collective voice as investors to encourage the changes that we want to see in the food system to build a more equitable and sustainable food system. And we are very proud to count over 380 investor members with over 70 trillion in combined assets under management.
So why are agricultural subsidies and farm payments particularly important, and how are they not in line with the global biodiversity framework?
Basically, the data from the UN is showing that global support to producers in the form of subsidies and other incentives makes up about 15% of total agricultural production value. So this means that these subsidies are vast amounts of money. And as they are set up today, they often incentivize the overproduction and overconsumption of certain harmful agricultural products, for example, the intensive production of livestock. This is concerning because particularly livestock, it is the leading driver of biodiversity loss globally, and it is responsible for more than 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that most of these subsidies incentivize monocropping, which is not in line with the targets of the global biodiversity framework, which calls for enhancing the variety of crops that we eat. For that reason, that same global biodiversity framework adopted in Montreal actually calls out for a progressive phase out or reform by 2030 of subsidies that are harming biodiversity while scaling up the positive incentive for biodiversity conservation and the sustainable use of land.
So in terms of the G20, what is it precisely that you're calling on finance ministers to do?
Yeah, so in this investor statement organized by FAIRR, we have 32 investors representing over 7 trillion in combined assets that are urging the G20 Finance Ministers to reform subsidies to align with the global climate goals that were agreed in Paris and also with the biodiversity commitments that were agreed in Montreal. So this statement is calling for that repurposing of subsidies to align with those commitments on climate and biodiversity, and align with all those efforts that are really needed to transition to reach net zero and protect and restore nature by 2050, whilst mitigating the financial and systemic risks. So what this investor statement is really showing is that investors recognize the financial risks arising from that failure to address harmful agricultural subsidies, which present systemic risk to portfolio, and that investors are really willing to use their collective voice to seek alignment between public funding and sustainability goals.
I just want to drill into that a little bit more. You mentioned intensive farm systems, and I wonder whether the focus is the farm systems themselves or elements that fuel those systems. So, for example, the way that feed is produced, the overuse of antibiotics, or perhaps the carbon intensivity of the farm operations themselves.
Yeah, well, a little bit of everything that you just mentioned. I think there's quite a few different actions that need to be taken to make sure that our food system becomes more sustainable, more resilient to some of these climate shocks that we're already seeing today. And some funding needs to be repurposed to really be able to start building those actions that we want to see. I mean, investors in the private sector can do a lot on their own, but if the public funding is going against those actions or not necessarily aligned with those actions, it's a little bit like swimming against the current.
Now, in the UK, farm payments are being redirected towards better and more sustainable farming. Do you think that the UK is in fact moving in the right direction?
Yes, actually, the UK has been moving towards farm payments for more sustainable farming, primarily through the Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS, which started its first pilot in 2021. And actually, we think that this is a really important and positive first step in the right direction from the UK government to support in the transition for farmers that are wanting to adopt more sustainable farming approaches, but need a little bit of that financial support to do that. For this program, for example, farmers receive payment for activities that support biodiversity, such as maintaining and establishing hedgerow trees, or even implementing a plan to really test and improve soil quality. So investors actually would be very eager to see this program comes to scale and to see similar programs implemented in other countries. And I think on the UK government, we are also seeing really positive action on the UK's international leadership under the Just Rural Transition Coalition. So this is a coalition of 16 countries that agreed at COP26 to align agricultural subsidies with climate and nature goals. So definitely lots of positive first steps from the UK government.
If we're talking about big hits, then ending the use of fossil fuels would fundamentally change the way that we farm, requiring that reconnection with nature while also transforming other supply chains. There are still billions of taxpayer dollars being used to support oil and gas production. So surely, if we're looking for action from the G20, then the most important thing that they could do is to end the subsidy of fossil fuels.
Yes, I hear you. I think phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies is a critical component of the transition needed to meet climate and nature goals. However, the issue of subsidy reforms for the energy sector has been recognized and discussed in much more detail by investors, policymakers, and other stakeholders compared to the issue of subsidy reform in the food and agriculture sector. And this is why we're trying to get more attention from policymakers and especially from finance ministers to address harmful subsidies in the food and ag sector, and also to make sure that in any discussions related to subsidy reform, we are also including the urgent need to reform the subsidies in the food and agriculture sector. So these issues go hand in hand, but I think we're trying to just kind of bring more attention to a sector that hasn't necessarily received as much attention as the energy sector.
That was Sofía Condés from the FAIRR Initiative. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back next week. Thanks for watching.